Thank you very much. The I'll just start with one of my favorite jokes. How many professors does it take to tell time? Well, clearly more than one because I totally messed things up last time. And so if you joined last time, I apologize for having to get rescheduled for today. That was my blunder, and I want to acknowledge that. And so I'm so happy you're here. And if you didn't know anything went wrong last time, then hey, welcome. I'm glad you're here. um, I want to share with you the a little presentation, a couple dozen slides that I did of Hemingway's St. Louis. And this book, I think, is it was a lot of fun to write, and it was a lot of fun to research, and I hope that you'll enjoy it because it was those St. Louis families that would go up in Michigan to escape that 100-degree stuff back before air conditioning. It was that St. Louis families that brought some of the most influential people into Ernest Hemingway's life. And so I'd like to talk about some of the Smith family tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and click, click, click. There. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about a couple of these folks. So it is a pleasure to make a presentation to the Little Traverse Historical Society. Oops, on July 8th. Again, so my book looks at the 5 families that shaped Hemingway's life and legacy. Hemingway never really spent any time in St. Louis, but these people from St. Louis certainly affected how he lived his life. And so the first family is the Charles/Merrill/Smith family, and the family of Bill and Katie Smith, and they did spend a lot of time in Michigan. The second family was from wife number 1, the Richardsons. Um, the third family was wife number 2, the Pfeiffer family, and it was one guy who made a lot of money in St. Louis, Gus Pfeiffer, who bought the house in Key West and funded a lot of that travel that Hemingway did and overseas over to his first safari. And then the fourth family was wife number 3. So first 3 wives from St. Louis, can't get much better than that, can it? Martha Gellhorn, we all know, was such a powerful professional woman, and their marriage was really a rivalry as much as it was a marriage. And then that fifth family, or maybe I should just call it an individual, was A.E. Hotchner, and he wrote one of the first, what I would argue is sort of a critical biography of Hemingway when he wrote Papa Hemingway, right after Hemingway, about 5 years after Hemingway's death. So here are the 5 families, and there's this whole host of supporting characters who are also from St. Louis. Helen and George Breaker, we'll talk a little bit about them, but they were very close friends, and then George was kind of an enemy, a frenemy. And Charlie Hopkins, after his time with Hemingway, Charlie Hopkins moved to St. Louis and lived the rest of his life in the metro St. Louis area. Carl Edgar, one of those Michigan friends. Carl Edgar was a descendant of a prominent St. Louis family. He was from Kansas City, but he summered in Michigan. And then 2 biographers have St. Louis connections. Bernice Kurt wrote The Hemingway Women, which is a very good book, and I would encourage you to read through it. It's been a long time since it was written, but she was from St. Louis. And Paul Hendrickson, who wrote Hemingway's Boat, he said St. Louis was his second hometown. He went to St. Louis University for college and has a lot of friends here. But I thought tonight we're just going to focus on that first family, and let's talk about getting to Michigan, getting from St. Louis to Michigan. So Petoskey is the rail center. All the trains that would come up from St. Louis and Chicago would go through Petoskey, would end at Petoskey. And Back in 1901, there was a particular trip and there was a little bit of romance on the rails. Um, the St. Louis Republic newspaper happened to record the passenger list, saying that there was over 100 people from St. Louis who were heading up to Petoskey in 1901, and there were two particular names that were listed out, people who would be staying at the Roaring Brook Inn at Harbor Springs. One was Laura Foster, and the other was Joseph Charles. And so I need to give you just a real quick detour into some family history here. So there were two sisters, the Merrill sisters, and one of them was Laura, and the other was Kate. So Kate and Laura. Now Kate marries this guy who's a professor. This guy is creepy brilliant. He finished graduate school early. He published in different languages. He was a scholar in multiple fields. He was a chairman at a rather young age. He was a chair of mathematics at Tulane. Absolutely the kind of person who we could say is married to his work. Was he likable? Not quite sure that he was. So Kate married the professor, Dr. Smith. Laura married this guy, Gilbert Foster. Gilbert Foster was he was one of the most eligible bachelors in St. Louis. There's even this little blurb when he decided to get married. And so first he gets married at age 25, and he marries into this JP Morgan kind of wealthy family from New York. And he's widowed at 26. So he inherits both money and family, these tremendous business connections. He remarries Laura when he is 31, and then he drops dead in 1894. It doesn't say why, but he passes away at age 40. And so Auntie Laura, after just 9 years of marriage, is widowed, and it's 1894, and she has inherited this massive fortune. So we'll put a pin in that. And now just a bunch of details. So Kate contracts tuberculosis in 1890, and she gives it to her two kids, Bill and Katie. She gives birth, as well as the disease, to Bill and Katie, and goes to Auntie Laura's house to give birth. She leaves the babies with Auntie Laura in St. Louis, and then she goes back for treatment at the tuberculosis sanitarium. Has it for almost 10 years. She dies in 1899, just a few weeks before Ernest Hemingway is born. Now, Professor Smith keeps the two oldest children. Now, he's a professor down at Tulane, and he's keeping the older kids. In the pictures there, that's in the upper right there, that's young Merrill Smith, and then, I'm sorry, that's YK, Kenley Smith in the upper right, and then Merrill Smith on the lower right. So the professor keeps the older kids, and Auntie Laura keeps Bill and Katie, who are there in the lower left. And Auntie Laura does not like Professor Smith, blames him for her sister's death, and in just another minute, Auntie Laura is going to get remarried. Hold on. Let's go back to the train, the romance on the rails. So Auntie Laura is traveling with young Bill Smith and young Katie Smith. She also has her nearly blind mother, Susan Merrill. So that party is going to Michigan. And meet Joseph Charles. He is the leading eye doctor in St. Louis. Now you're traveling with your blind mother and you happen to run into the town's leading eye doctor. Wow. He's single, he's traveling alone, and he's also staying at Harbor Springs. Oh my gosh, you can just see the romance starting. Well, in May of 1902, they get married. His father was a big minister in St. Louis, and so he officiates the marriage at Auntie Laura's apartment, and then it says immediately afterward they departed for a northern trip. Well, I have an idea where they were going. Of course, up to Michigan. So let's talk then about Michigan here and bring in all these elements together. So the starting points for Hemingway was Walloon Lake. Obviously, the Windermere Cottage is built kind of there on the far right, and Auntie Laura, she participates in the Charlevoix Home Association, which is kind of, on the opposite side and the opposite end of Lake Charlevoix. So they're actually pretty far away at the very beginning. And of course, the Historical Society right up there at the top. And so here's this picture, a lovely picture from about 1900, Walloon Cottage on the lake, and it's right there on the water, and it's very isolated from noise, and I'm sure there was lots of wonderful nature that they could enjoy just from the cottage as well as exploring. And then of course, Auntie Laura is spending time in the cottages of Charlevoix. And of course, these cottages, I mean, these cottages are bigger than the Hemingway home in Oak Park, or at least as big as the Hemingway home in Oak Park. I don't know if any of these things still stand. Maybe somebody afterward could tell me. But in 1899, she is in the cottages, and really since 1887, all those cottages were centered around the Belvedere Hotel, and they've had these white tablecloth summers all just for a long time, starting in at least 1887, if not even earlier than that. In fact, it's up here at the Charlevoix Home Association where Kate Merrill Smith passes away. Finally, everybody meets. And so the Hemingways buy Longfield Farm in 1905, and Auntie Laura in 1913 buys the old Stroud place, and it becomes Charles Farm in 1913. So now everybody's on the isthmus. I know that's a pretty big piece of land to call an isthmus, but they're finally on the isthmus, and of course they meet in 1916. That's kind of the accepted time, the year of meeting. They meet in 1916 in Horton Bay. Their lives are forever changed after that meeting. Let's just talk about a couple of folks here. So very famous picture here from Michigan showing Katie on the left and Bill Smith on the right. They were very close friends of Hemingway. I always like to point out the age differences. I think that some folks who might think of Hemingway going to Michigan thinks he's hanging out with his peers. But, Hemingway in 1916, this picture is from about 1920 or 21, Hemingway is actually 17 years old. And, Katie Smith is like 25. She's out of college, and then Bill Smith was in college. He was 21. And so here's this teenager hanging around with all of these older folks. I think we can see a lot of opportunity to influence this young budding writer. So Katie Smith's influence on Ernest Hemingway, as I'm sure a lot of you probably know, she's the one who introduces Ernest to Hadley Richardson, her school friend from St. Louis. Katie winds up marrying Ernest's friend, John Dos Passos. She moves to Cape Cod, where she dies tragically in 1945, and certainly influences the character in the female character in Ernest Hemingway's Summer People. Bill Smith was the best man at Ernest's wedding to Hadley, went and visited Ernest and Hadley in Europe in 1925. He was a lifelong friend. He outlived Ernest by more than a decade. He died in Florida in 1972. He influenced characters in multiple Ernest Hemingway stories, especially the 3-Day Blow. It's really just Nick Adams and the Bill Smith character. This picture was from Ernest's wedding, so 100 years ago, right up there in Horton Bay. We're going to be seeing a lot of pictures, and so I hope when this picture gets published a lot this year, that I went to a lot of work to identify who all these folks were, and I cannot find a single book on Hemingway that actually gets everybody. So here they all are. Howell Jenkins on the left, Charlie Hopkins, who had moved to St. Louis next, George Breaker standing there in his dark 3-piece suit. He gives the bride away. He's from St. Louis. Dutch Palethorpe, patron of the Historical Society Museum. Ernest there in the middle, Bill Smith arm in arm with Ernest, Bill Horn next to him, Carl Edgar as we move to the right edge, Carl Edgar, who was descended from St. Louis, and Luman Ramsdell, who was a friend of Dutch Palethorpe and actually passed away just a few years after this picture was taken. Auntie Laura, she died in 1924. And she was laid to rest in this little town called Louisiana, Missouri, and Charles Farm was abandoned. It was the setting for multiple Hemingway short stories, and the life there certainly shaped Ernest's work. When I think of when I think of just the brief time that this all happened, so it went from 1916 when they first started meeting, and then in 1924 it's abandoned. So that 8-year window, wow, what a powerful 8-year window that was in Ernest Hemingway's life. And even when Bill and Katie went back to sell the place in the end of the 1920s, they remarked that it just wasn't the same without Ernest and all that fun that they had, that idyllic fun, that it just wasn't the same. This was only chapter 1 of the book, so all the other chapters are filled with romance and romance and adventure and lots more. I want to point out again, because we're going to be looking at a lot of photos, I wanted to point out the photos that were taken at Charles Farm. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of these here with the 100th anniversary of the wedding. And I want you to notice the wallpaper, because this wallpaper was throughout the house. And as you're looking at these different photos of Hemingway in Michigan, of the wedding, look for this flowered wallpaper, because it'll identify that to Charles Farm. All of these bench photos, including the one on the cover of my book, those were all taken in St. Louis. Every once in a while that gets attributed to being a Michigan, because it does look very rural and woodsy, but it's actually a rural woodsy corner right in the heart of the city of St. Louis. I always like to give credit where credit is due. And so our photos came from the JFK Library and newspapers.com, and the Hemingway Foundation of Oak Park, and the Oak Park Public Library, as well as the Durand family in Georgia, the descendants of Merrill Smith. You know, all those folks, none of them had children except one, Merrill Smith, the one who wasn't in that Hemingway. None of them had children except Merrill Smith, and even he died after just having 2 children. And it was his descendants that had some of these wonderful photos and shared them. And I also want to thank the Initiative for Urban Research, the Department of Political Science, and the College of Arts and Sciences at my university, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, because they made the book possible. So all roads lead to St. Louis. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and would love to hear your stories and your observations about who about all these folks here who used to hang out in Michigan.
Well, Andy, I'll tell you that I was so excited when you started talking about Bill Smith, because we have a great big picture of Bill and Ernest Hemingway in our Hemingway exhibit. And I didn't know too much about Bill before your book and your explanation. So it's great now when we have visitors that I'll be able to tell them a little bit more about that. So
excellent.
Very exciting for me.
Does anyone know if the Charlevoix Home Association, if the Belvedere Hotel stands, if any of those old, the cottages stand? It looked like it's still a development, but I wasn't sure how much of the historic architecture still stood.
The Belvedere Hotel is gone, but a lot of the Belvedere Club is still there, and the summer people are still a lot from St. Louis and Chicago. So a lot of those homes are there, but the hotel is gone.
Thank you.
Some of the foundations are there. I teach in Charlevoix, and my students talk about they go and play on the fountain foundation, and some of those things are still there. So you can do a little exploring.
Excellent.
So it looks like we've got a question in the chat. Somebody wants to know exactly where were those St. Louis pictures taken?
The exact location of those St. Louis pictures were at the corner of Cates Avenue, C-A-T-E-S, and Goodfellow. Cates and Goodfellow. There was the house where Hadley lived was right next to that corner. There was a church at the corner, and then they had the property directly behind the church. And that also may be why it looks kind of dark and secluded through there, because there is this church that was kind of casting a shadow on the house next door.
Look, Stephen, a question?
Yeah. You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm muted. Well, this is hardly an important question, but I noticed, since you're speaking about that bench, that Hemingway appears to have a cigarette, and he's exhaling at that moment the photograph is taken. And that surprised me, because he was never known to smoke in his life.
I think that might be a bit of an overstatement to say that he was never known to smoke. Mm-hmm. He did give up smoking early because he said it interfered with the taste of his food, and to look at the pictures of him when he was in Europe, I can't think of a single cigarette picture, but it's pretty clear.
Well, the other time in his life, actually, he certainly indulged in other ways, but not with tobacco. I know this is highly important.
I think explaining these pictures is actually very important, and honestly, I'm a minutia guy. So when you get the book, there's like this whole section of footnotes in the back with just the obscure details, exactly like this. I even talk about some of the smoking. We know about the smoking really from Hadley's letters, and that picture where he's exhaling the smoke, Hadley loved that when he would blow the smoke through his nose. And so obviously he was doing that while he was on his courting visit. He only made 2 trips to St. Louis while courting, 2 courting trips to St. Louis to see Hadley. And that was the second one. And he was actually staying with Hadley at the house on Cates Avenue, which is now it's all just a big vacant lot. The church is gone, and they bought what was Hadley's house, and that's all gone too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for that question. It's great.
other questions? I can't see the whole screen at once. Or if you want to type anything in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well.
I just have a comment if I can.
Yes, please.
Hey, Andy, hello. Thank you for your donation of your autographed book for our upcoming Hemingway Centennial Wedding Reception that we're doing in Walloon Lake. We are recreating the wedding reception here in the village with members of the descendants of the family, as well as some of the Dilworths who ran the Pinehurst Inn in Horton Bay where the reception was held. So we're really excited about that on September 3rd. And we've got some great food items that are actually passed down from those family members that have been provided to us. And we have a couple actors who are playing Ernest and Hadley, so they'll be guests of honor at the wedding. And it's going to be a really fun weekend. And I just want to say hi to Peter. Also, he helped us with our Nick Adams read earlier in the year as well. So it's just really great to see continued interest and different angles of the stories that because he just touched so many different sectors. And I have your book. It came in the mail from McLean and Aiken this week, so I'll be sitting down to read that when we wrap up with the presentation tonight.
Excellent. And I did restock the museum with some copies. And so I hope everything goes well, and that folks can find it and tell me what I get wrong. I will say I think I have misplaced a little bit the exact location of Charles Farm. It looks like the actual location of the Charles Farm was just a little bit north of where I kind of put it right there on the waterfront, but really it's removed in an area that's now, I believe, a forest reserve. Anyway, my location, that map is off just a little bit. So when the book comes out, in its second or third or fifth edition, we'll be sure and get that corrected.
We've got another question in the chat. To what degree were the Gellhorns observant Jews?
That is an excellent question, and I think the answer is not at all. In fact, I'm trying to think. If I can think. I can't think of any. I cannot think of any religious influence there, or any kind of practice or tradition. I can't think of one that is in any of the Martha biographies about her recollections as a child growing up. I just don't think there is. I don't think there is anything, and I'll just tell you, I never really thought of them as being Jewish, but I suppose that they may well have been. Now that I think back of I never really thought of the names, Gellhorn and then Fischel, and I guess that they probably did have Jewish heritage, but to my knowledge, and I've seen nothing that would indicate that.
We've got another question. We'd like to hear some more about wife number 2 and wife number 3's families.
Certainly, I would love to say a little more about that. Wife number 2 is Pauline Pfeiffer, and I will say I may be taking liberty to call all them a St. Louis family, because they were all from Iowa, and the Pfeiffers, there were like 8 or 10 Pfeiffer siblings, and 3 of the brothers came down to St. Louis. Now they started the Pfeiffer Chemical Company, and they became fabulously wealthy doing it. And so they made their company and they made their fortune in St. Louis. But they were kind of just passing through, because Henry Pfeiffer and his brother Gus Pfeiffer, they built their company up, and they decided to go ahead and they started buying up. They bought Warner Pharmaceuticals, which is now Pfizer, and so they bought Warner, the Warner Company, and so they moved to Philadelphia from St. Louis. And then from there, they bought the Hudnut Company, which really did more perfumes and makeup things. And that was in New York. And so they moved to New York from there. But they took their St. Louis wealth and they moved on with it. And then the third brother was Paul. He didn't like the chemical business, got out of it, and he was running a land business, and he was buying up lots of land in Arkansas. And you can go down to Arkansas and at Piggott, Arkansas, and that's the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum is there from Arkansas State University. So it was those three brothers that came to St. Louis, and it was Paul, who was the father of Pauline, and Pauline and her sister Virginia, Ginny, they are the ones who went off to Paris, and everybody did things in circles back then. People didn't just go out on their own for entertainment; they went out in circles of friends, and so Ginny and Pauline got in the circles that overlapped with Hemingway's social circles, and they went ahead and met up at some point. We all know that Pauline, she really does break up the marriage to Hadley, and Ginny was homosexual, and her partner, I'm blanking on her partner's name. Her partner for many years married Aldous Huxley, the author Aldous Huxley. And then I think they still maintained their relationship during the marriage, and it was kind of a later marriage. Pauline tragically, I won't go to her death just yet, but I'll say that Pauline, Ernest has two children by Pauline, and they live in the Key West house. And so Gus Pfeiffer, Uncle Gus, bought that house for them. Today it's the Hemingway Home Museum. And that was a gift from Uncle Gus, and it was paid out of this wealth that started in St. Louis. And so my thinking was just that there are all these wealthy St. Louisans who keep buying all this stuff for Ernest Hemingway. They lived off of Hadley's trust fund in Paris, and then they lived off of Uncle Gus's generosity. There were multiple trust funds, including one that was established for Ernest himself by Uncle Gus. And so there was, all this St. Louis money that made Key West happen. And then he goes to wife number 3, Martha Gellhorn, and here's another very wealthy family. And the Gellhorns were very prominent in the community. They were out there, they were active, and Mrs. Gellhorn was very active in the suffrage movement. And what's kind of funny, so was Hadley Richardson's mother. And I'm sure somewhere there is a picture that has the two Hemingway mothers-in-law in the same picture, because they were both very, very active in that suffrage movement. They went on. There's a school here in St. Louis called John Burroughs. It is a just top class private school, and the Gellhorns were one of the founding families. I started to say before about Pauline Pfeiffer. She did have a tragic death. She kept the kids after the divorce. She kept the house and the kids, and they would certainly spend time with Ernest, and kept the kids, and then the young son, Gregory, the youngest son, he had some suppressed issues of sexual identity, and he started to undergo a sex change operation, and was often a cross-dresser, and he got caught dressed as a woman. He got caught and going in a woman's restroom, I believe, was the charge back in 1951, and it was that arrest that led to this big phone fight between Ernest and Pauline just screamed out in pain later that night, and was rushed to the hospital and died in exploratory surgery. So did the stress of the moment, the fight with Ernest, did that put her body in a position where she had an underlying condition, but brought it on? We won't know, but she died at age 51, which is rather young. Martha Gellhorn, I'll just add one more thing. Sorry to not be logical in telling the story. Martha is the one who went to Cuba, was with Ernest in Cuba, and found and renovated and rented the Finca Vija. I do not pronounce that correctly, and I would welcome your correction on that. I don't speak Spanish, but the Finca Vija, I got to see it one time, and it was just so amazing to think, oh my gosh, Martha Gellhorn's the one who found this and renovated it. And then Ernest bought it later. He didn't like it at first. And I thought, here's another St. Louisan who finds the home that Ernest is going to live in. It wasn't until Ernest bought it as a Christmas present to themselves that Ernest actually owned his own home for the first time.
We have another question in the chat. What and where is the museum in Arkansas?
That museum, I have not been there, but it's on my list here this summer to go down and visit. It is the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum and Learning Center. It is owned by it's owned by Arkansas State University. So it has a good institutional ownership, which I think helps with the funding and the organizing of it. And it really is Paul Pfeiffer's home. That when he left St. Louis and moved down, to Piggott, Arkansas, where he owned just 10,000 acres of land. I mean, he owned just tremendous amounts of land. And anyway, Piggott was the place where he went. And some of the folks who I've talked to who've been down to Piggott and said, it's really kind of, I don't know if obscure is maybe the best word, but it's really kind of an obscure little town. There's not a lot of like anchor institutions. It wasn't necessarily a center of industry or culture or something that might be a draw. That the choice of Piggott must have been very practical, I guess is what they're saying. I don't mean to be offensive about Piggott at all. I haven't seen it, and I'm sure it's a lovely town. Yet they were trying to figure out why Paul would move there, and certainly it was a place to run his land operations. But was he trying to be close to some institution? Was he trying to be close to some kind of business connection? Apparently not. But I hear it's a worthwhile visit.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Any more questions from the group? Stephen.
Right. You haven't talked about Hotchner at all, and I wonder if you would say a few words about him and St. Louis.
Certainly. A.E. Hotchner was quite a character, and he's rather prolific in his writing. He was born in St. Louis, and he wrote an autobiography, a memoir called King of the Hill, that recounted his young years during the Depression in St. Louis. And it was made into a movie. The book came out about 1970. The movie came out in the early 1990s, I think. And anyway, Hotchner and his family lived in St. Louis. I got to meet his brother, but I've never met Hotchner himself, before he passed away recently. He was very generous, though. He went to the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, and he had a lot of education, even though he didn't really use his legal training. He had that preparation. I think that served him well for his many business enterprises. His closeness with Ernest really lasted during Ernest's decline. And I kind of think that if I hope a theme people pick up in my book is it's pretty easy to see Ernest's decline as by the way he treats these St. Louisans that he's with. And Ernest, was breaking off relationships just one after the other. And Ernest would get angry and fire off letters. He always would put his anger in writing, which makes perfect sense. And Hotchner kind of missed all those shots, and Bill Smith to an extent too. There was one nasty exchange with the Smiths, but Bill Smith survived that, and Hotchner, even during those times of Ernest's just overbearing illness, Hotchner was still a friend, and Ernest still seemed to, was able to engage with Hotchner, and even up to the very end. And I always think that says something important, I think, about Hotchner, that just Hemingway was getting rid of all these other people in his life, but he made time for Hotchner still. So very special relationship. A friend of mine who does a lot of television work interviewed Hotchner, and apparently Hotchner was a bit of a character, and including in his writing. And he said something like, in this document it says, that like you were born in this year, and in this other document it says that was a different year. And he goes, it's the year that I say it is when I'm writing. And so it kind of makes me go, uh-oh, if we're relying on the specific facts.
If you could refresh my memory, it seems to me that Hotchner did some adaptations of Hemingway's work for the film industry.
You are correct.
I can't remember details about that. I don't remember exactly which books, but on the other hand, it could, well, you tell me, because you probably are more recent in your research.
I don't go very deep into that at all. You are correct. I mean, I remember reading it and doing my research for the book that Hotchner had done some of these, and Hotchner was working on this when Ernest died. And so in doing that, he was doing that with Ernest's blessing. And I don't know that he might have done one more project after Ernest died, but I think that there was, after Papa Hemingway and the lawsuits to stop it, I think that it was, I think that Mary Hemingway and a lot of the Hemingway family were done with Hotchner by 1966. So,
since you brought up that biography, Papa, I think it's just entitled Papa, isn't it?
Yes.
Whatever. It is such a graceful book. Hotchner himself was a very fine writer.
I agree with you.
And he had filled with gossip, and that's the fun of it. Oh, by the way, speaking of gossip and Hemingway's biographers, Hemingway's boat, I think, tops them all. It just filled, and I love the way the author would take an obscure character and then tell the rest of the story even after Hemingway was finished. Like the boy that came down to Key West, hitchhiked down, and then ingratiated himself and spent a couple of years in Key West and went out on the boat. And then that's the end of the association with Hemingway. But that author, Robertson, is it?
Samuelson, Arnold Samuelson.
Yeah, and that's it. Well, he takes that fellow's story for decades afterwards. Even if I like that aspect of that author's approach.
I completely agree. I adore that book, and it is my favorite Hemingway biography. I think he kind of has an essay on sources at the end of his book, and I kind of did that motivated by him at the end of mine, and kind of lump Hotchner in that too. But Paul Hendrickson did a great job, and he came to St. Louis, and I got to visit with him, and it was really that was really neat. He just did such a creative job. It is so well researched, and I even pull out that Arnold Samuelson example in my book only because I completely agree with you. It shows how meticulous and how thoughtful he was as a researcher.
Yeah, exactly.
We have another question in the chat, wondering if you could estimate the relative wealth of the three wives' families.
I actually do a lot of that in the book. I'm sorry, I don't have a sense of the numbers, but I do try and take the there's not a lot of data I can go with, but I did make some estimations based on the trust funds and the amount that was generated by these trust funds, and so that can kind of give a sense of how much money people were living on. And I'm sorry that I don't have that, and I don't know that I could look it up in a timely manner, but they were clearly very, very wealthy families, and I would say, by today's standard, they would certainly be in the tens of millions of dollars, if not even the hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly with, when you think of unearned income like stock value and things. They bought land, and they bought, as a family, the Pfeiffers, they bought land and they bought stock when times were, they bought low and they sold high, and that's how to make that money.
It seems to me that Hadley's trust in dollar terms was not very large, and they used it in Paris to scrape by. In other words, it kept them from starving, but it wasn't as though they could live well. It was a relatively small amount of money that was available.
Right. But it sustained, it gave them sustenance during a time when Ernest was generating no meaningful income. Occasional articles, Right. Yes, good point. And what I found so interesting was that Hadley's trust fund and Pauline Pfeiffer's trust fund were seemingly exactly the same. And it made me wonder if there was some kind of a tax threshold there that you could put X amount in trust and protect it from taxes. It just seemed odd that those numbers were the same, years apart.
Any other questions? I'm searching through the gallery here. Don't see any.
Well, I can ask another question, if you don't mind my dominating here. So Hemingway, of course, is so famous for the characters that he drew from real life, from up there, Petoskey and elsewhere, and put them in, sometimes in a scandalous fashion, into his short stories. Did he ever do anything like that with the families of these wives?
That's a really good question, and I am not in a position to answer it. I do not. I love the study of Hemingway's life. I do not know his literature closely enough to say that. I will point out, though, that if we look at the people to whom Hemingway's books are dedicated, that there's not a book dedicated to Pauline Pfeiffer, but rather to Uncle Gus. And he I'm trying to think if he dedicated something to Hadley. I know he gave Hadley the royalties.
Well, I think the sun also rises. I'd be a little bit. I think he did.
And I know that in 1940, Martha writes Stricken Field, and Ernest has Farewell to Arms, and they dedicated those books to each other. But Anyway, Uncle Gus got the dedication of one of those books there in the early 30s. Pardon me for not being able to pull that title out, but that's the only thing that I can think of. I know in the short stories, he I believe he makes reference to Auntie Laura um, in one of those the summer people 3-day blow those stories that took place at Charles Farm. But I don't know. I don't. He wrote a lot of stuff that didn't get published. He wrote it for just circulating. I think for when he was angry. That's my guess. That's my guess. Do you have any suspicions, Stephen?
No, because I didn't think about that and it's been many years since I've read all of his short stories, so I don't have any insight there. It just popped up to me about perhaps the most controversial of his short stories is Up in Michigan. And because he took real life characters, and it's a scandalous story about essentially a date rape, and these were real people. Maybe the incident happened, maybe it did not, but it caused a rift that was never healed in Hemingway's family. Like his sister would hardly ever talk to him again. And I think his mother too was so upset that it caused a great rift with her too. He was disparaging people that were easily identifiable. Even the title.
I know that. I know that those that there was at least one book where I think the publisher said, "Hey, you gotta. We all know who you're talking about. You need to blur that line a little better."
Well, since we're talking about that, in The Sun Also Rises, every single character is absolutely recognizable to themselves, as well as all the friends associated. And there couldn't be any way of disguising them. And he lost all those friends.
Right.
I don't think anyone continued in his life after that. I'm exaggerating perhaps just a little bit, but essentially that's the story.
Yeah, he ended a lot of relationships.
Yes. All right. Do we have any other questions? We're almost at 8 o'clock here. Let's see. So this question, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, is this question for me or for Andy? Tell us about Windermere House. And the question about the nephew. So yes. So Ernie Mainland, Ernest Hemingway, Ernie was Ernest's nephew, and recently passed away and owned Windermere Cottage. And so the family still does own the cottage, and it's still used. Currently doing a little bit of renovation work there. And so it's still in the family. I think the question is what will happen to the house. So still in the family. All right. Any other questions? So as we mentioned, the book is available at the museum gift shop. And where else, Andy, can we pick up a copy of your book?
It's obviously going to be on big Amazon.com, but you can also go to hemstl.com, and that's the book website. And you can get there through Facebook as well. And I've got some interesting little trivia things up there on the website if you felt like going there. And if you click to buy it there, you can buy it through an independent bookseller.
Very good. hemstl.com, you said?
hemstl.com.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Remember, we've got programs next Thursday and the following Thursday. You can find those on our website, petoskeymuseum.org. And thanks, Andy, very much for that wonderful program. really exciting to get the St. Louis and Petoskey connections solidified a little bit.
Well, thank you for rescheduling, and I apologize again for messing things up last time.
Not a problem, and well worth it. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now, and thanks to everyone for attending.